IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm Anushka Saxena, a research analyst with the Takshashila Institution's Indo-Pacific Studies program, and I'm joined by two colleagues today, Manoj Kewalramani, who is the chairperson of the program, and Amit Kumar, who is a fellow research analyst. Welcome to the
Thank you,
episode.
Anushka. Thank you.
Great. So, for our listeners, our aim with today's episode is to discuss the various developments in US-China relations that have taken place in the past few months, and there's a lot of them, and whether the guardrails created and the mutual emphasis on the need for stability will lead to a prosperous Xi-Biden meeting at the upcoming APEC Summit. I think the sentiment, just to kick it off, is that it wouldn't, but there is again a mutual emphasis and significance being attached to dialing down some of the simmering tensions. And of course, the two leaders meeting is much anticipated as they could not meet due to Xi Jinping's absence at the G20. But a host of high-level officials on both sides have met with each other in the past few months. But it does not seem likely that the announced meeting will result in a détente. And so I think the first scene-setting question that I would like to ask you both is then what exactly should this meeting signal to us? What should it mean to the international community, which has been expecting the two sides to talk and resolve their differences for quite some time? Manoj, over to you.
Hey, thanks, Anushka. So I think what it means is that I think everybody is going to be watching quite closely, and it is important that these two countries talk to each other because lack of communication spiraling into something worse, given the nature of their competition, but also given the recent incidents that we have seen in the South China Sea of close encounters between jets and militaries, the tensions between China and the Philippines in the South China Sea, and this deep sense of mutual suspicion that exists between the two sides. It makes the threat of escalation quite real, and therefore it's extremely important in that sense for the two sides to be talking at different levels. At the same time, I think given the significance of both the US and China to the global economy, some degree of conversation on economic issues is also extremely critical because all of this trend towards self-reliance, de-risking, all of this is taking place within the context of China's rise and the competition between the US and China. And while that's a fact of life for this era, I think it's extremely important that there is some conversation and some dialogue so that we don't end up seeing even greater global uncertainty when it comes to the global economy, which then adversely affects other countries, including developing countries like India. So even from that point of view, I think this is an extremely important meeting because some degree of stability in the relationship amid what is going to be prolonged strategic competition is useful for everybody. So to that extent, it is a positive signal that both leaders are meeting, particularly given where we were in February this year after the balloon gate scandal.
Yeah, as Manoj
Right.
said, the fact
Amit,
that
your
these,
thoughts?
the relationship between these two largest economies started to destabilize around the time when Donald Trump came to power. And over the course of time, both the countries have realized that the rivalry and the contestation that has gone on between these two countries has been destabilizing for the entire world and has sharpened the divide between the countries, the middle powers, etc. And there has been recognition that there needs to be some sense of stability And not just from and as again, as Manoj said, this something that the contestation that between the US and China, what has been going on for some time now, has had a destabilizing impact on other countries as well. So something which is desirable from their point of view as well. So yeah, the talks are important to give some sense of stability amidst all the problem that is going on between the two countries.
Right. Okay. So I think we can establish that between the two sides, to avoid confrontation, there is a need for competition, but also conversation. Uh, and on the point about conversation, let's backtrack a little bit and talk about the dialogue that has already been kicked off in the past few months in the lead up to the Xi Biden meeting. We know that 8 types of dialogues had been suspended during Nancy Pelosi's, in the aftermath of Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taipei, August last year. And then issues surrounding, like you said, Manoj, the South China Sea, the Balloon Gate incident from February 2023 have plagued the relationship. But soon after, we've seen exchanges of high level officials between the two sides, like Gina Raimondo, Janet Yellen, and of course, Blinken, and most recently, Wang Yi's visit. So, has this dialogue been able to establish the conversation and the stability that we've just talked about? Have there been critical announcements and breakthroughs that signal that tensions are finally simmering
Yeah, of
down?
course. I mean, the last
Amit, we'll
4 or
start.
5 months, we witnessed a series of developments which point towards a possibility that both the sides are ready to talk now. And this has culminated into now the announcement of that both the leaders, Xi Jinping and Joe Biden, will meet on the sidelines of APEC Summit, and there would be indeed be a summit on 15th of November. And in this regard, the groundwork was laid by a series of visits, starting with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's visit to Beijing in June, which then later paved the way for U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet L. Yellen to visit China in July, the next month, wherein she held talks with Chinese Vice Premier Li Feng on economic ties, trade and investments. And the key takeaway from that visit was that she kind of downplayed the Chinese concerns regarding decoupling and diversification, and instead made a point that what US is actually trying to do is not decouple from China, the second largest economy in the world, but de-risk whatever problems and whatever problems that they think that are that concerns the security. So only those areas where they think that security would be a concern, they are looking to de-risk and not necessarily decoupling. And there were also two working groups that were established on finance and economy. And these assurances were then again reiterated when US Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo visited China in September, where she encouraged that the American business should continue to invest in the second largest economy. And while but what she also did was she raised that the concerns around Beijing's arbitrary fines and rates on Beijing's businesses. And these were some of the concerns that were, reiterated by the American side.
Okay. So clearly, these previous meetings have been an attempt on both sides to assuage some of each other's concerns, but not a lot of mention has been, perhaps because of the nature of the visits, not a lot of mention has been laid on some of the core and critical issues, such as export controls or the issue of US support to Taiwan, and the concerns surrounding those cannot be assuaged easily, and perhaps there hasn't been an attempt to assuage them as well. So Manoj, what would your thoughts be on that?
Yeah, I think Amit's very clearly laid out what's happened in the last few months. Let me just roll back the clock a year ago. In November last year, Xi Jinping and Biden met in Bali at the sidelines of the G20. And I was going through what the statement at that point of time had said, because both sides seem to, every time they meet, and in the last 1 year, every time diplomats and other officials have met, they've basically talked about, hey, respect the Bali consensus. So it's worth going back to seeing at least what that meeting had said, right? And this is from the Chinese readout of that meeting, which was extremely long. But this is the agreement that they said, that the two presidents agreed that their respective diplomatic teams should maintain strategic communication and conduct regular consultations. Their financial teams will continue dialogue and coordination on macroeconomic policies, economic ties, and trade. And the two will work jointly for the success of the COP27. They also reached common understandings on conducting dialogue and cooperation in public health, agriculture, and food security, and agreed to make good use of the China US Joint Working Group in this regard. And they also talked about people to people exchanges being important, and pledged to agree to expand cooperation in all sectors in this regard. When I went back to what I had thought about this meeting and these outcomes at that point of time, my conclusion was that that it's useful that these two people seem to be talking and the channels of conversation appear to be reopening. Because, like you said, after Nancy Pelosi's visit in August last year, channels of communication had been shut down. And I argued at that point in time that this is about finding a new normal in the relationship rather than reverting to any earlier state in the relationship. Now, what we have seen since then is that you ended up in February with a situation where, because of the hysteria around that Balloon Gate controversy, all of this agenda that was outlined of dialogue at these various different levels essentially got suspended. In March, at the NPC, you had Xi Jinping publicly, for the first time, naming the US by name as engaging in containment. So it told you that things had hit a low. In a previous episode, I know that we've discussed what happened since March, and how that led to finally a meeting between Blinken and Wang Yi and Jake Sullivan and Wang Yi in May and June, and subsequently the dialogue channels have opened. So why I wanted to go back to this history is to just make the case that what we are seeing today is essentially an outcome of what was discussed a year ago, but which got suspended because of this mutual acrimony that took place in February. And therefore, what we are seeing today is essentially an effort to try and implement this agenda. So it's a delayed effort because of other issues that came into place. And some of these, it's good to see that some of these are actually new mechanisms that are being set up. Amit talked about the working groups that are being created. Those are new mechanisms that are being set up. You talked about export controls. There is an export control information exchange mechanism that has been agreed upon. What that mechanism achieves, one needs to see, given the fact that at least reporting tells us that the latest October 17th export control measures that the US took, those weren't communicated through this information exchange mechanism. And you've had new dialogue platforms in the form of an arms control mechanism, which has been restarted. You've had a new consultation on maritime affairs, which is not military to military dialogue, but essentially led by foreign affairs ministries on both sides. So you're having these new systems set up, which are trying to respond to the new nature of the relationship as it is today. And like we've argued, it's an effort in trying to achieve stability, and it's an effort in trying to address very specific issues. When you say de-risking, when you say export controls, it's trying to address very specific issues rather than stepping back and looking at the broader relationship. Which is, say, if you go back to the Obama era, you had the strategic and economic dialogue, which was much more broad in that sense. But today, you're having much more narrower issues that you're trying to address. And that's partly because you can't necessarily have a broad-based strategic and economic dialogue when there is such a deep competition. So to me, that the nature of the dialogue mechanisms also tells you that this is not something that is leading to some sort of a détente or some sort of a new G2 type agreement or reset or any of those phrases, but it's essentially about trying to address prickly issues so that the relationship does not spiral downward any further.
Right. I think on a slightly pessimistic note, but the question that brings to my mind is, you talked about the Bali consensus, and you said there was a delayed implementation, that we're seeing a delayed implementation now because it was derailed by a couple of events in the starting of the year and the end of last year. But we're seeing new developments like this that are about prickly issues like the October 17 export controls. And again, they point towards the problems in actually thinking about implementation of a consensus of this sort. So should we then say that this delayed implementation is never coming because the nature of the relationship has become so tense, and a G2 kind of a consensus isn't really possible?
Yeah, I mean, I would rule out a G2 consensus given the way things are today. I mean, if you look at American domestic politics, I don't think there is any value electorally for anybody to argue positively for a positive China-US relationship, right? I mean, the difficulty, I think, is also underscored by the fact that one of the most popular media platforms which used to cover China has recently just announced that it will be shutting down the China project. I think that it just tells you, and if you read their statement of why they say they're shutting down, it tells you a little bit about the atmosphere around China policy in the United States. So I think that therefore some sort of a grand bargain, G2, whatever, is highly unlikely. What is likely to happen is, again, efforts to try and achieve some degree of stability. And I think this is a Biden team effort to try and achieve this. And I'm saying that purposefully, knowing the fact that in the next 1 year, you're going to see elections, presidential elections in the United States. Latest polling tells us that Donald Trump is leading in key battleground states. So if you end up with a change in presidency, it might lead to, it might not see some of these measures continue. But I think what the Biden team is trying to do is to try and institutionalize some of these things so that they at least sustain and survive whatever may be political upheaval in the United States. So the short answer to the question is I don't see a G2, a detente, grand bargain, and any of that on the horizon, or even likely at all. But what I do see this as an attempt to try and at least make sure that you resume dialogues at different levels, particularly on prickly issues. The proof of the pudding, however, will of course be whether we see the Biden-Xi meeting ending with an agreement on resuming military-to-military dialogue. The one key impediment, or at least the one obvious impediment on the surface of it that was there, which was Li Shangfu, is no longer in the scene. So that would be something that one would look out for. To me, if that resumes, then that would be a significant step forward.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Right. And I think the closing down of the China project is indeed an unfortunate affair, given that, we saw during Cold War times that research on the Soviet was so important in bringing about insightful and informed policy on matters pertaining to how the US dealt with USSR, and the kind of work, the data-oriented and the qualitative work China Project and other think tanks or academia personnel are doing in the US is pertinent to make informed policy decisions. And so this kind of it isn't exactly this attitude wouldn't benefit the US strategic community. That said, you talked about Donald Trump, and clearly the trade war that was launched under Donald Trump in 2016, in the period between 2016 and 18, led to, in my opinion, this rapid decline in the quality of ties between the two sides, although here and there tensions have continued to persist for the longest time. But the fact that this quote-unquote war has turned technological at its core is, again, in my opinion, a major part of the challenge in thawing of the US-China relationship today. So Amit, let me start with you. around the same time as Pelosi's visit, we got the Chips and Science Act last year, and then the October 7 export controls. And now, as Manoj highlighted, the October 17 export controls have hit China unknowingly, and then China has retaliated with its own export restrictions in solar panels and EV related technology. So, how do you think this is playing out in derailing some of the emphasis on stability, or is a conversation around these export controls, for example, as was discussed under uh, Janet Yellen, significant
For
to
me,
maintain
the
export?
crux of the problem is that the relative positions of the two parties here are irreconcilable. So, even though, I mean, even before the summit has happened, the hopes regarding the summit, whether it will lead to some sort of breakthrough or not, are as such quite low. And the problem is here that, again, the irreconcilable positions between the two parties. The American and the 2 points of where they do, where the two sides do not see each other eye to eye is on the issue of tech restrictions and I think the Taiwan issue or the Indo-Pacific issue, larger Indo-Pacific issue. So the American position largely entails that, I mean, it recognizes that there are structural issues that underpin the bilateral relations, and it needs to be recognized. The American position is that cooperation in other areas should not be held hostage to differences on broader issues of security. And the US insists that, in fact, its trade related sanctions that so far it has imposed on China are aimed at only building, as they call it, high fence around only a small yard of technologies, which leaves other areas, everything that lies outside this small yard of a small yard open to cooperation, right? And the position on Taiwan even is that it recognizes that PRC is the sole China, but it wants China to back off from military posturing in the Taiwan Strait, and so. And the American insists that apart from these key core issues, there are other non-core issues where cooperation can happen. But the Chinese position, however, emphasizes that no stabilization of relations and cooperation in all other peripheral areas can be successfully realized unless unless the US guarantees some sort of concession or assurances on these core and sticking issues. And maybe it could be decoupling, technological restrictions, or US aid to Taiwan. And this has now what has manifested in the US China ties. And this is some, and ironically, this bears some resemblance to the nature of India China relations as well, where India is the one which takes the position that China is taking with regard to the US. And we see China taking the position what the US is taking with regard to China. And yeah, so overall, the positions are irreconcilable, and therefore it's unlikely to see that we are unlikely to see any major breakthrough in this from this talks or the summit.
Okay. Interesting thoughts.
I just want to add one point to what Amit said. He said the positions are irreconcilable, and I think that, in general, I agree with them. On specific issues, I think it is very difficult to reconcile. Uh, you know, the nature of the US-China competition, particularly say around Taiwan, and the way both sides have, particularly how the Chinese have been playing it up, it's extremely difficult. But I will say that what the last year of US-China diplomacy has told us. And I think it is really important. And that is one of the reasons why I think this conversation is really useful. Particularly, I think if there are students who are listening, or people who, follow diplomacy as an art, as a craft, I think it's really important to look at this last 1 year with granular detail, because it tells you that even when something may seem extremely, terribly irreconcilable, the art of diplomacy is to find areas where you can create opportunities for dialogue, where you can create opportunities for agreement, and where you can reconcile aspects of what may seem completely irreconcilable. And I think the last year tells you a little bit of how that can be done. If you go back to February and look at where we are at today, it tells you that if you put the hard yards, diplomacy can achieve certain things. And I will give credit, to the Americans, because it is they who've been largely pushing. for this new normal. And the Chinese, as they have identified opportunities, have played ball in different domains. So credit to both sides, but I would say the Americans are pushing it. But it just tells you that diplomacy is the art of squaring circles, which might seem impossible to do.
Right. I think that's a very important point, and I think Amit also brought this up, which would be my final question before I have a few others on India-China relations. Manoj, Amit mentioned a phrase, issues in the Indo-Pacific, or issue on the idea of what the Indo-Pacific order, a regional order, should look like. And you also talked about the Bali consensus, and I didn't hear conciliation or a conversation on the issue of military ties, right? And then we also talked about arms control and putting together of a conversation on maritime issues, which wasn't again necessarily military in nature. So to combine those two aspects, do you think there is an inherently military nature to the irreconcilable differences, barring the efforts of diplomacy, in how the US and China approach the Indo-Pacific? Do you think that US's support to Taiwan, US's military support to Taiwan, or US's non-acknowledgement of China's supremacy in the South China Sea are indeed the factors that are leading to China's concerns surrounding US not seeing it as a peer in the region and not respecting its position in the region? So do you think that is the reason why China is unwilling to restart military dialogue, or is becoming more and more aggressive by the day?
Look, I think that is what the Chinese would like us to believe, right? That it is the Americans who are not playing ball, and therefore we can't talk to them unless they play ball. The fact is that both sides, I think, recognize that you need to have some degree of conversation, because you cannot have instability in the relationship. You cannot be having stability in economic ties while your jets are engaging in close encounters, waiting for an accident to happen. So this is a deliberate game of chicken that is being played, particularly from the Chinese side, to try and exact some degree of concessions from the Americans. What those concessions are, I mean, the Chinese would be the best to answer, but I think that predominantly, if you read what Chinese media is saying, those concessions have to revolve around Taiwan. What exactly do they imply around Taiwan is a matter of negotiation between China and the United States, right? They will have to, like you said, recognition of Chinese positions on Taiwan, and perhaps the rolling back of some degree of American engagement or American rhetoric on Taiwan, whether that is around arms supplies, whether that is around training, whether that is around independence, whether that is around Taiwan's participation at international forums, or any of the above, right? I think that this is Beijing essentially playing high stakes chicken to try and get some degree of recognition from the Americans, and it is purposeful. There is no reason for Beijing to hold back on military to military dialogue, unless it wants some of these things. So that's how I also see it, and I think that it is, the American strategy has been to essentially highlight China's destabilizing actions to the rest of the world, whether it is around the Taiwan Strait by crossing the ADIZ or the median line, whether it is in the South China Sea by releasing footage of these risky encounters, whether it is, detailing the tensions between Filipino ships and Chinese ships, and China's again irresponsible behavior. So that's the American approach, right? Which is to shift the onus on China to say that it is upon them to therefore restart this negotiation. And I think that's essentially what's happening. Therefore, I say that the big outcome from this summit that I would anticipate, which signifies positive forward movement, would be re-establishment of military to military dialogue. If we see that, I think we will see, and then we can sit and assess who got the better of it. But my argument would be that if we see this starting, given the things, if we see military to military dialogue starting, given the current situation as the way things are, I would see it as a win for the United States, because I don't think the US has conceded on any of those issues.
Right. I think that's an important point, and it also brings me to my final question surrounding some of the parallels that Amit, you mentioned about the position the perhaps US-like position China takes in the context of China-India relations, and that while India would want a core issue to be resolved before we can move on to other things, China says that that core issue should be kept aside, and uh, other things should go on as business as usual. And of course, China hasn't been as forthcoming towards India in creating meaningful dialogue and stability in the relationship as perhaps it has been in reciprocating to the US's advances for stability. So, Amit, to begin with you, why do you think this is, and what's China's approach, what's China's approach been like in its conversations with India in the past few months and years? And of course, feel free to draw any insights from how China sees India's relationship with the US and how it factors that in its
So this entire situation begs the question: if the Chinese position, the Indian position are similar vis-a-vis the US and China respectively, what is it that is preventing the Chinese from talking to the Indians and addressing the core issues that they feel? And my sense here is that the Chinese do not believe that India has that sort of a leverage that US has vis-a-vis China. And this is my guess, that this is something which is stopping the Chinese from talking to India and conceding to position, or agreeing to some concessions that India is seeking on certain core issues. Another question to answer, and I would love to hear thoughts from you and Manoj as well, is that if the US has the Chinese have also always said that it sees its relationship with India through the US lens, right? And if some sort of breakthrough, the hopes are not that high, but if some sort of breakthrough is achieved on this front, would the Chinese be ready to talk with the Indians?
Right. Manoj, your thoughts first, and also could you also shed some light on whether it is indeed true that China isn't talking with India, or is it that the talks aren't leading to a meaningful conclusion?
Yeah, look, I don't think that we are having any dialogue, significant dialogue at different. I mean, we just talked about the different ministerial level conversations that have happened between China and the United States. There is no parallel between China and India. We've had foreign minister level conversations on occasion, and those have been in response to certain situations, or they have been on the sidelines of certain multilateral meetings. But we've not had a sustained dialogue. I think the last time that Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi spoke substantively was October 2019 in Mamallapuram. Since then, there has just been this one informal, thing in Bali last year. So we've not really seen substantive dialogue between the two sides, and whatever conversations we've seen some mechanisms at lower levels talk. We've seen dialogue at the corps commander levels in Ladakh and things like that. So we need to see sustained broad-based dialogue on different levels, and I don't think we are seeing that developing. Even track 2 level conversations are difficult between both sides. So it's a very different situation from what we are in the China-US relationship. And I agree with what Amit is saying, that in some ways there is a similarity in between what the Chinese are arguing with the Americans and what India is saying to China. That there is a core issue and you must address the core issue and whatever. But what we are seeing in that case is that the United States has not addressed the core issue to the satisfaction of Beijing, but has been able to restart other dialogues, and Beijing has conceded. Whereas in our case, it is not conceding, and that I think is a reflection of how Beijing views the world through the lens of relative power. It feels that, like Amit said, it has leverage. I would just put it in a different way, saying that I think it feels that there is a relative power differential, and India should accede to what Beijing is arguing. From my point of view, I think that it is. You do need to have dialogue at different levels, but to what end is something that must be seen. And there is a qualitative difference in the Taiwan issue and what's happening in Eastern Ladakh. I wouldn't think that it would be very difficult for Beijing to accede to a dialogue with the United States if, for assume, there had been hand-to-hand combat between Chinese and American forces, and 20 Chinese soldiers had died. So there is a qualitative difference, in terms of the situations, but also at a sort of broader level, there is some complementarity given the fact that there is a relative power differential. I think that, look, it's a shame that both sides are unable to talk. I think that Beijing should recognize and realize that it is damaging itself further by trying to coerce India to seek what may be very ephemeral concessions around the United States, because there is no way that New Delhi can give Beijing a veto in terms of its relationship with Washington DC. Um, so I think it's high time that the really smart folks in Beijing realize that it is your strategy to try and coerce India to not play ball with the US has only pushed it far more closer to the US. It is worth recognizing India as an actor which is autonomous, which is functioning on its own interests, and engage with it purposefully. If your objective is to try and maintain some daylight between Indian strategy and Indian objectives, and American strategy and American objectives. So engagement is a far better option, and it can only be achieved when Beijing realizes that that is possible. So to me, that's where I think the situation is, and I think it shows a difference in Chinese thinking around both the countries, and in terms of the hierarchical worldview that Beijing holds.
Right. On that note, I think this has been a fascinating discussion. Some key points that emerge for me is that expectations for a breakthrough from the upcoming Xi-Biden meeting at the APEC Summit should be tempered, but it is indeed a diplomatic success point to come from things like the Pelosi's visit and balloon gate to this. Of course, core issues, challenges surrounding core issues remain, and it would be hopeful to say that how China has been battered continuously to give in to some of the diplomatic maneuvers made by the US could someday also be true for India. That said, thanks Manoj, and thank you Amit for your insights and remarks, and thank you to our listeners for tuning into another episode of All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.